Everyone. My name is Shelley Lambert, and I'm presenting this talk on behalf of Tim Ellison. He's at another conference right now, so I won't try to do a very bad English accent, so apologize. If you were coming here to hear him speak, you'll hear me go through some of these slides instead. I'm an AdoptOpenJDK committer. I work at that project a lot. I'm also an EclipseOpenJ9 committer. I also helped bring testing to the Eclipse OMR project, and I'm the IBM Runtimes test leader. So, what are we talking about today? We're talking about the AdoptOpenJDK project and its rationale, its mission, ensuring free Java for the community. And we're going to try to go through just some of the basics of how the project works, a bit of a brief history, the rationale, the goals, the motivation for the project, a little bit of a roadmap, and then looking at some of the build farm tech that we have at that project. So, diving right in, I'm going to start really basic. What is Java? Probably many people in this room already know what it is, but I'll briefly cover. A JDK, a Java Development Kit, consists of a JRE and some tools to compile and debug Java. So what is the JRE then? It's a class libraries, it's a virtual machine, and it's a web start some applets. Gliding through the first part because I want to get to the juicy bits. So what is OpenJDK then? It's the reference implementation for Java 7 SE and onwards. It's licensed with the GPL and class path exception. And it's the source code to build your own Java. So users like Twitter, Alibaba, Amazon have augmented the JDK to have their own custom builds that suit their needs. And there are many commercial and community builds also available of this OpenJDK. It's, in fact, widely available via multiple distributions and builders. So you may know that Oracle's commercial JDK builds are from OpenJDK, and they're evolving to have the two be essentially identical. There's a good article online. You can talk to me after if you want to read more about that. IBM's JDK is based on EclipseOpenJ9 for Java 8 and onwards. So it's the same virtual machine that runs across many versions. And in fact, OpenJ9 can be built as a component of OpenJDK. And of course, Azul has theirs, there's Ice-T. I'm not going to talk too much at length. I'll also just reference this, which is off the Adopt website, to explain that you probably already know the Java ecosystem is in an interesting times right now. And I think the purpose of this talk was just to assure people that you can still, and you will still, be able to get free binaries for your products, for your applications, and that's where AdoptOpenJDK comes in. So it's a build farm for building OpenJDK binaries. In fact, not just building them, but testing them. We run nightly pipelines and create nightly builds across many platforms. It's fully open source, fully transparent. The entire pipeline, all the way down to how machines are configured, through the build, through the testing, through the distribution, can be seen in AdoptOpenJDK GitHub repos, and I'm going to guide you through some of that today. And the purpose really is to have consistent quality across all platforms. So as you can imagine, if there's lots of different distributions and builds and not all of it's transparent, it's hard for a person who wants to download a binary to know what they're getting, how it's been built, how it's been tested. So the purpose of this community effort, and it is a large community now at AdoptOpenJDK, is to come together, use common resources, common minds, a set of people that come from different companies to bring to the Java community binaries from the best of all of those skills. So the history of how we got to an AdoptOpenJDK project, we have to go back into a little bit of OpenJDK history, and I won't dwell too much on this except to say Sun launches OpenJDK. moving along the timeline, Oracle acquires Sun. OpenJDK becomes the reference implementation for Java 7. A bunch of new features come along and get added in. 2014, we see Java 8 come along, and now this is an older slide. I had to add a little plus sign after the 10 there because already we're, as many of you know, we're in 11 and working on 12 and moving forward down that path. And in fact, there's a nice talk later today that I'll reference later about how do you keep up with the pace of change in these days with the new migration stories. Anyway, I didn't create this slide, but someone kindly created what are some of the current OpenJDK challenges. That thorough testing was challenging. There was a problem with visibility of contributions. There were discussions happening on incorrect mailing lists, and there was a lot of work. The structure of that project probably not rising to the challenge of the new pace of change. And out of all of those challenges and out of the need to standardize the building and testing of binaries and making them available for the community, AdoptOpenJDK project was born. All right, so we've come through, and I won't go into detail on how attempts were made. There are a lot of other kind of details along the way of, you know, how we arrive at this, but here we are. It's what, 2018, we have an AdoptOpenJDK project. But in fact, last year, in 2017, I was asked to comment on whether what we were starting to do and how we were transforming our testing inside of IBM to make it much more flexible, much more agile, much more open and transparent. Could this help that project? And I believed it could. We started to get involved in bringing some of the testing to AdoptOpenJDK. In the meantime, IBM also open sourced their Java stack. So I think there are some nice talks about open liberty. There's a few people from the OpenJ9 team here, including myself and others, sitting in the front row. Hi, everyone. So we've open sourced all of the Java stack, and we're looking for a way to, you know, how do we get this out to the community? And AdoptOpenJDK seemed like the natural place to do that. April of 2017, we open sourced our testing infrastructure, and within a few weeks, we were building or running verification builds against the builds that were being built at the build farm. And since then, we've seen extreme growth at the AdoptOpenJDK community. There are, it says here, 60 plus repos. I saw this morning there are 84 at the moment. Well over 600 volunteers working over the past 6 to 9 months at the project, and a constant flow of new names and faces and people helping coming into the Slack channel. And I give some links a little later on if you aren't already on some of these channels. We're forming a technical steering committee to make sure that we continue forward with the goal of having high quality and secure binaries and keeping to the pace of delivery that we want to keep, which would be the promise of getting it within a few days of the next version. So I guess the point here is to say, just to take a little bit of a pause, is to say that this is about community and open collaboration. It's not about, you know, a single mission or agenda. It's about everybody recognizing that there are a lot of benefits to having all the different people who do this around the world come together and bring their best minds and their best solutions into one place so it can benefit the whole ecosystem. All right, so what is it? What is this? It is build, test, deploy, tirelessly every night, and then again at release time. So we have nightly and release pipelines. The nightly pipelines run a certain set of tests, actually quite a large set for a nightly pipeline, I've been told by people from other companies. And then the release pipelines, we bump up the testing even further. For the nightly and release binaries, if they build and if they pass the tests at a level that we're happy with, they are published to the website and also available through the API, which is a really nice API for downloading. We also publish Docker to Docker Hub. So what this really looks like: build, test, deploy. Just keep saying it: build, test, deploy. The high-level view is OpenJDK Mercurial repo is mirrored into GitHub. The repo is cloned into Jenkins. A build job is kicked off. If the build passes, then the test suites are kicked off. If the test pass, the binary is deployed to GitHub releases repos. So for each of the versions, we have a JDK 11 binaries, JDK 8 binaries repo, and that's how we tag and make these binaries available through the website, through the API, and also apply some extra archiving so that it's easy to know what you're picking up. Okay, so back to this story of standardized, open, transparent at all layers. Well, you can't build, test, and deploy without some machines. So there's actually a layer I haven't mentioned here, and that's the infrastructure layer, so the lab machines. And even those, as I hinted earlier, have the notion of infra as code. We want everything to be in a place where you can see it. So, and we're using Ansible playbooks and Docker to accomplish most of this configuration. The infrastructure repo actually lives here. The playbooks are broken out into several roles so that we can reuse pieces. We start with a main YAML file and then have these categories of roles that we have. So you can take a look in there. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I do want to go back. The build layer, again, you'll notice what we're using for tooling for each one of these layers. We're trying to choose stuff that everybody knows, everybody is comfortable with using, or it's easy to onboard people. Because one of the other kind of subtle missions we have is to get a great amount of people working here and helping bring better solutions to the story. So once all of this is working, are we going to actually say, oh, that's it, it becomes static? No, from my point of view, from the test perspective at least, I am going to constantly look for ways we refine the story and make it a lot better as we move forward. So for build, we use actually bash scripts and Jenkins pipelines. For test, we have a very thin layer of, I will barely call it a framework, but it's a layer to make all of the different tests that we bring from around the world together and feel like and look like the same type of tests to an automation framework, and in fact to developers who we want to be able to have easily run testing on their laptops or in their own labs. And then the deploy phase, there's an aspect in the build pipelines and, as I already mentioned, the GitHub release repos. So we get passed over here. We can't actually mention infrastructure without mentioning that we have a lot of very generous groups that are supporting us and have donated machines or funding so that we can have lots of machines in the farm. So I just want to put a shout out to the sponsors of this effort, because without them, we wouldn't have machines on which to build and test these JDK binaries. So I can tell you that everyone on this list believes in open collaboration and believes that open collaboration leads to greater innovation. So I'm really, really thankful that we have so many people joining and believing in the mission. All right, so build, I just want to make sure everyone knows where at least the starting point is to where all of these things live. If you have questions about how things are built, that's your repo that you want to go to. The high-level view, you can't really read it, but the whole point here is there's a top-level entry point which says, you know, make JDK any platform, that then goes through and calls a configuration phase. It calls a native build phase, and in the cases for Docker. There's actually a Docker script as well. And then it goes on to run the actual build script, and upon which that gets sent to, I'll talk about the pipelines later, we'll actually step through it, but it gets sent to the right machine for building, and then it kicks off the test phase. And I guess what I'd like to say about testing here is you can see we have a great number of tests that we bring together. So we think of ourselves as curator of fine tests. We have functional and regression tests in the first two boxes, and you can see that nightly that's a lot of testing that gets run. System tests, this also comprises of a lot of heavy load and stress testing. I put the number 25,000 there. That's for both the sanity and extended levels. So I'll talk really briefly about this because we have two other talks where we go into way more detail about the testing that happens in the open projects. But what I'd like to say is that for our nightlies, we run tests that are tagged with the sanity tag. And for the releases, we run sanity and extended testing. But it's more than half of the testing that's tagged as sanity. So it's not a small amount of testing that happens on the nightlies. And then we have the external tests. And for some people at this conference, that could be quite interesting because they are comprised right now of 8 applications and running all of the functional suites of those applications. So things like Open Liberty and Scala, and there are several thousand functional test suites that can be run. And then we also run 3 microprofile TCKs, and we're running all of these nightly, and it's actually more than 50,000 tests that get run. And those are run inside of Docker containers. And there's 2 reasons for us to do that. One, it makes it actually a lot easier for us. We don't have to worry about what is needed to be installed on machines. But 2, it is the story as we move forward in the Java ecosystem, a lot of people needing to run Java inside of containers. We produce Docker images that you can download, and we want to test them. So these particular suite run inside of containers. We probably will have a set of startup tests that will also be run on actual platforms, because as we know, if you've been in verification for a while, you know that some things only happen directly on real hardware. So we'll also be adding some startup tests there. But for now, the focus is getting stuff running in containers. And then we have compliance tests and performance tests. So performance tests, I don't think there has been a whole lot of open performance testing happening around the world. I actually have a full talk tomorrow about this very topic and some of our plans moving forward. I get a lot of people saying, oh, well, you can't do it, it's not possible, you don't have isolated machines. But I go into more detail tomorrow about why this is important and why it actually matters that we have some performance testing here at Adopt in the open for people to run and see there and run and view comparative analysis, but also so that we make it easy that you can actually run any of these tests locally or in your own labs. So you can run it on your own isolated machines and see what your results are and compare them to what the open results were. All right, and finally, the deploy thing, the deploy phase. There's a lot of repos where little bits of the activity happens to be able to make sure that these binaries get deployed to the website and are available through the API. I list them there. It's not rocket science, but it is an exercise in proper archival techniques, I guess, to make sure that we can track things and know how to get back to something if we need to. All right, so very quickly, I just wanted to step through how this looks in reality, and apologies, this is screen grabs from the Jenkins server. I don't trust that my network connection will hold, so I'll just step through it by screen grab, but you can actually go to the server and see this yourself, although hope that you aren't able to launch a pipeline unless you're a part of the project. And then I hope you will come and help launch pipelines. But here, we'll look at the OpenJDK 11 pipeline, and it's split out by version. And if I click on that build link, then what happens is it's going to bring up some choices for me. And I don't know, I think that this is probably not a clear enough slide to tell you there's something wrong on this slide. So if you can tell me what's wrong on this slide, you'll win my praise and adoration. This is actually an older slide, so there is something missing from here. But what this is telling you is the configurations that we want to build and that we want to build for. So it's by platform and JDK implementation. So you can see that we have the platforms listed and what implementations we're going to build and test. And you can actually see in that second part maybe that it's actually just a little check box. Test it and then publish it. So if I don't check those, I would just be running the builds. I wouldn't be running the testing. We test everything we build, so those are typically not unchecked unless you're really just vetting the pipeline itself. So for nightlies, this is what it looks like. For the release pipelines, it's the same story, but we add a little bit extra tagging in the release tag field there. So we go to build. And what happens is it kicks off a lot of platform builds, platform and implementation specific builds. And you can see a set of them in this list. And if I drill down into any one of those builds, then I can see what's happening at that level. So for the JDK 11 hotspot build, we run a compile job and then we kick off. You can see the testing that gets kicked off. So a whole suite of OpenJDK regression tests, a whole suite of system tests, a small set of performance tests if this is a nightly. It's the external tests that I mentioned and what I'll call the external extended tests. Right now we're actually running the extended tests on the nightlies as well. The plan would be, of course, to only run those on releases, but we wanted to, for the meantime, make sure that we were testing a lot more with the nightlies. We are kind of limited still, even though we have generous sponsors. We can't turn on all of the testing for every nightly build, but we've done as close to that as we can get with the resources we have. So this all sounds great, right? So how do you get it? Once we finish all that, where do these go? That's the website where you can find the binaries. Probably many of you know that already. And essentially, you come to the Slack channel. Here's what I've noticed about how the project works. You come to the Slack channels and you go, hey, what about this? Can I get this? Or I'm doing this with Java and I need this. The community is extremely responsive, at the moment anyway. If you come with an interesting conundrum or you're challenged because you know that shortly you won't be able to find binaries for the platform or version that you need, you can essentially come to this community and ask for help. And I have seen for the most part you're going to get it. There's a big effort recently underway to get some installers going to make it a lot easier for people who have needs for those. The Docker images we're publishing and they're being refined, and the story is becoming better and better there, and also the test story for those is becoming better and better. And essentially, I would say ask for it and be pleasantly surprised that for the most part you're gonna have a response that's positive. And also just come and help dig in. If you need something, don't just ask for it. Say, hey, I have started with this solution, but I'd like to do it in the open, in a community where it doesn't just benefit me, it benefits everybody. So looking forward, again, revisiting this whole layers. There's a lot of, obviously in those 60 plus or 84 repos that we have, some of them are not specifically these build and test repos, but a lot of them relate to them. So that's why I've divided it up into these sections. What are the near term, and I say that next 6 months to a year plans for some of these categories of activities that are happening in the project? So for the infrastructure layer, there's an activity underway to make sure the playbooks are sanitized. For the Unix platforms, they're running really well, but for Windows and Mac, they need to be refined and running better. There's still manual steps that have to happen to make sure that build and test machines are up and running and standardized in the farm. So we'd like to do that with Ansible instead of going and having to manually intervene. We also want to automate and regularly run Ansible to vet and make sure that the lab is running clean. I can't tell you how important this is from the test perspective. If any of you know, when you go and you see that there are suddenly 4 new failures in a suite of tests and you've never seen them before, and the test framework that you're calling into doesn't give you enough information about why it's going wrong, one of the things you want to rule out is that something didn't change on the machine and the machine is in a sane state. So being able to have that layer be stable is super important for us. And then looking at on-demand hosting. So instead of having the static set of lab machines, obviously, and everyone who's ever experiencing this knows, the cheaper and better and more efficient and effective story is to actually have hosts when you need them and not when you don't. So we have some people looking at that as well. For build, we want to actually exploit Docker for builds, partly to remove some of the unknowns from our lab machines. We also want to improve our build times to make them run faster, because the faster things run, including testing, the more we can do. So improve that, and I guess the main point here is also simplify. If I go into that build repo, right now I know my way around it. It's actually become a lot simpler than it was 8 months ago. It keeps getting better as we move forward, but the idea is that simple is better, because we have that goal of easily onboarding new people. We have the goal of having scripts that are maintainable, and when someone asks a question, they should be able to go to those repos and answer it themselves. They shouldn't need to have like some long-term expert guide them through it. So documentation here is also not written down, but obviously always on the roadmap. And for testing, again, we have the same kind of story as I've mentioned for builds. We want to be able to test smarter. So within IBM, we actually, a few years ago, looked at change-based testing and had a solution for that with the tools we were using. Now everything's moved into open source repos. We'd like to pull some of that forward so that we can bring that to the open community for everyone to share. Essentially, where we're needing help and we would like to have help at this project would be to triage those millions and millions of tests we run nightly around the world. How do we triage smarter? Well, one thing is we can apply some tools to be able to do this better. So write some services, some analytics services. We actually have a repo at Adopt called Test Tools where we've started to do that. We'll talk a bit more about that in these other talks. But we also are taking the notion of collaboration further. We have some work that we're going to be starting this fall with University of Edinburgh for some fuzz testing so that we can better test compilers and be able to apply testing at other layers so that if you find the failures lower down in the stack, it's easier to triage than if they happen way up in a system level test. And then, as I mentioned, the open performance testing story. So, and the roadmap for deploy, obviously more installers. There's been a request by a lot of people in the community for that, so that activity is already starting and it's underway. But essentially, thinking about what are the ways we can get these very high quality binaries to more people in the community. So how do you participate? Well, I'm going to list those again. Those are the starting points, but actually the overall guide to the repositories, you might as well go to the Technical Steering Committee repo, because that's the guide for you through all of the repos at the project, and that gives you an overview of the activities. I'd like to say what we covered today, or what I tried to take everyone through today, was some of the basics, the brief history, the rationale, what it really is about. It's about bringing all the great minds from the Java community together to produce high quality, free binaries and make that ecosystem flourish. We want to collaborate with as many people as possible because that leads to better products, better innovation. And then we covered briefly some of the tech, and that's really just as a teaser so you know where you can come and step in and help. I would be happy to guide you. And just because I kept referencing it, we have a lot of other talks that are slightly related to this topic, or at least later today we have Teresa talking about the release cadence for Java, or JDK release cadence, and what strategies you can employ to keep up. And then tomorrow I'll be talking about performance testing for everyone and how we can make it easier, because performance testing is often talked about as the impossible thing. Charlie will be presenting on the OpenJ9 for Spring Boot performance tomorrow and Cloud Native story. And then on Thursday, we have Jayashri talking about Kotlin, and Sophia and I talking about testing OpenJDK implementation. So that one slide where we talked briefly about the different types of tests, we're actually going to go into a fair amount of detail in that. And I want to say that it's for all of the activities that happen at this project, it's not just a build farm. It's a place where people come together and create really unique and interesting stories of innovating in the space of building and testing and deploying the binaries. So if we can do something better, or if you're looking for something that you need, we really do want to hear from you. And I think that's about all I had. If people have questions, please feel free to ask, but I hope to talk to you afterwards. I'll be over at the IBM booth, but also come to any of those talks because they're all really interesting. This conference has been wonderful so far, and we're just really getting started, so I hope to have a chance to talk to you all.